The commitment of a father. Sarah Miller had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times. She'd practiced calm, prepared for surprise, even discomfort. She was ready for anything, it seemed, except the absolute, soul-crushing indifference of the man she loved. Standing in the glass and steel fortress of Vance Capital, the morning sun glinting off Alex Vance's custom-tailored suit, Sarah felt the world shrink to the small, tense space between them. Alex, a titan of finance, barely spared her a glance as he dismissed a multi-million-dollar report. When she finally forced the words past her lips, "Alex, I'm pregnant," the silence that followed was not shock, but calculation. He looked up, those famous, penetrating blue eyes meeting hers. There was no warmth, no joy, only a cold, hard finality. He didn't ask a single question. He simply leaned back, a gesture of casual cruelty, and delivered the sentence that would shatter her life into 1,000,000 sharp pieces. "I won't marry you." It was a dismissal colder than any market crash. In that instant, the man who had whispered promises was gone, replaced by the ruthless CEO. Sarah left the office with her back straight, the ultrasound photo burning in her pocket, the air knocked from her lungs not by sorrow, but by the swift, surgical precision of his rejection. She fled the city, abandoning the betrayal, seeking refuge in the quiet mountains of Asheville, North Carolina. She found a humble apartment and went to war with her new reality, alone. The loneliness was suffocating, the burden of impending motherhood a constant ache. She didn't know then that she was carrying 2 lives, or that her quiet battle for survival was about to be rocked again. Not by the echo of his cold words, but by the undeniable proof that some truths, once seen, can never be unseen. The morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows behind the imposing mahogany desk, where Alex Vance sat in his characteristic custom navy suit, examining financial reports as if nothing in the world could disturb him. Her heart hammered as she cleared her throat, barely able to find her voice. "Alex," she began, her voice trembling in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like thunder, sudden and sharp, cutting through the calm stillness of the room. He didn't look up at first. When he finally did, his piercing blue eyes met hers, but they held no warmth, no surprise, no joy, only calculation. The seconds stretched into silence until he leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands, and said almost lazily, "I won't marry you." No emotion, no questions, just that. Cold, dismissive, final. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved despite every red flag and every warning from her own instincts, was gone, or perhaps had never existed. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. There was nothing to say. Her mind searched for logic, a reason, some fragment of the man who once whispered she meant more to him than any business or title. Instead, she was looking at someone else entirely, someone indifferent, impenetrable, and ruthlessly detached. He didn't ask whose it was. He didn't ask how far along she was. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply stood up, straightened his jacket cuffs, and said, "This conversation is over." She wanted to scream, to weep, to demand recognition. But something inside her, something deeper than pride, kept her still. She nodded once, turned, and walked out of the office with her back straight, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. As the elevator doors closed behind her, her vision blurred with tears, but her face remained serene. She knew in that moment that she was completely alone, and yet she also knew she would survive. Not for him, not for the past, but for the life growing inside her. The escape to Asheville, the days that followed, were a blur of silence, cold rain, and a crushing reality. Sarah packed her belongings and left the city without telling anyone. The lease for her apartment was under Alex's company name. She couldn't bear the thought of staying there one more night, breathing the same air that once smelled like home, but now reeked only of betrayal. She moved back to a small town 2 hours away, the one where she'd grown up, Asheville, North Carolina. Quiet and removed from the chaos of the corporate world. She hadn't been there in years, but the streets felt familiar enough to make her feel like she could at least breathe again. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment above an old bookstore and began working remotely, taking on small freelance design projects at night while morning sickness ravaged her body. Each day was harder than the last. There were no calls from Alex, no attempts to find her, no texts asking if she was okay. The rejection hurt more deeply than she allowed herself to admit. She cried most nights alone in her narrow bed, holding the ultrasound picture to her chest as her belly slowly began to swell. The loneliness was suffocating, but she pressed on. She attended all her doctor's appointments alone, checked off prenatal vitamin lists, and tried to eat as best she could. Her heart ached, not just from the absence of love, but from the overwhelming pressure of doing this alone. She had no family to rely on. Her mother had passed away 2 years prior, after a long battle with cancer, and her father had been absent since she was a child. There was no one but her, and the 2 tiny lives quietly forming inside her. By her second trimester, the doctor confirmed she was expecting twins. She smiled when she saw them clearly on the screen. 2 small profiles, tiny arms moving independently, 2 separate heartbeats thumping strong and fast. It was a brief moment of hope in an otherwise gray existence. She walked out of that appointment clutching the printed sonogram photos, tears rolling down her cheeks, this time not from fear, but from something closer to awe. No matter what came next, she had them, and that had to be enough. As the weeks turned into months, her body grew heavier and more tired. She still worked long hours because medical bills piled up fast and insurance barely covered the essentials. Some nights she fell asleep with her laptop open beside her, aching everywhere, but refusing to give in. She kept a notebook by her bedside where she wrote letters to her daughters. She didn't know their names yet, but she wrote to them as if they were already here, as if they could hear her voice in the silence. She told them how much she loved them, how hard she was trying, and how one day, when they were older, she would tell them everything honestly, but gently. She didn't allow herself to think about Alex. When his name popped into her head, she shoved it away. The man who had once made her feel seen had vanished like a ghost. There was no point in mourning someone who had already chosen to disappear. Her focus had to be on the babies and surviving each day until they arrived. But even as she tried to let him go, something in her chest remained bruised. Not broken, but wounded in a way that would take time to comprehend. And so, she moved forward, quiet and determined, having no idea that fate was already working to bring their worlds back together in a way neither of them could have imagined. The hospital encounter. By the time Sarah reached her 8th month, exhaustion had become her constant companion. Swelling in her legs made it hard to stand for long periods, and sharp lower back pains forced her to sleep sitting up most nights. Though she rarely complained aloud, her doctor started noticing signs of concern during her weekly checkups. The babies weren't gaining weight as quickly as expected, and Sarah herself was clearly pushing her limits. After a brief scare, involving shortness of breath and contractions that suddenly started and stopped, she was admitted to the local hospital for observation. What was intended to be a preventive overnight stay quickly became more serious when one of the twins began to show signs of distress during monitoring. Doctors decided to perform an early C-section. Sarah was too spent to argue, barely able to process the words as nurses gently prepared her for surgery. Everything felt surreal. The cold of the hospital gown, the bright lights of the operating room, the blur of voices around her. She squeezed her eyes shut and whispered a silent prayer that her daughters would come out breathing. And then she heard it. The first cry. Thin and faint, quickly followed by a second, slightly louder one. Tears streamed down her face. Both girls were alive, tiny, fragile, barely 4 pounds each, but breathing. The nurses whisked them away to the neonatal ICU while Sarah was stitched up and sent to recovery. The following days were a haze of beeping monitors, IV drips, and waiting. Her daughters were named Clara and Eliza, names she'd written in her notebook weeks earlier, but hadn't dared to utter aloud until they were safe. At first, she could only visit for brief periods, sitting by their incubators, talking in a low voice through her tears. They looked so minuscule, their faces almost swallowed by the tiny caps and blankets meant to keep their body temperatures stable. It broke her heart to leave them each night and return to her hospital bed alone. But she knew they were in good hands. Still, the pain of not holding them freely, of not being able to take them home, weighed heavily on her spirit. The doctors informed her that due to the baby's prematurity and her own post-operative weakness, they would all remain in the hospital for at least another month, possibly longer. That time stretched to 2 months, then 3. Sarah's savings dwindled fast, but she refused to show her panic. She regularly pumped breast milk, sat by their side as often as they allowed, and used her free hours in the hospital room to pick up online design work on her old laptop. She was alone, painfully alone, and the mental weight was starting to crack her resolve. She hadn't had a visitor in weeks. The nurses were kind but busy. Her body was healing, but her heart felt paused, caught between survival and the life she wanted to build. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Alex arrived at the hospital, completely oblivious to who was there. He wasn't visiting for personal reasons. A high-level business partner of his had been in a minor car accident and was admitted for observation. Alex, always the loyal figurehead of his empire, figured it would reflect well to stop by and check on the man in person. But between illegible signage and a distracted receptionist, he took the wrong elevator and got off on the pediatrics floor instead of general care. As he walked down the bright hallway, confused, he caught a glimpse of something. Someone that caused his feet to freeze. At first, he wasn't sure. A woman in a hospital gown, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, was standing near a double stroller, adjusting a bottle with practiced hands. Her back was to him, but something about her stance, the curve of her shoulders, was familiar. She turned slightly, and the light hit her face. It was Sarah. Alex stood there, stunned. He felt like the air had been punched out of his lungs. She hadn't seen him yet. She was humming softly, rocking the stroller tenderly. Then she looked up, and their eyes met. The world seemed to stop for both of them. Her face went pale. He took an uncertain step forward. Neither of them said a word. And then, slowly, he looked down into the 2 babies sleeping side by side in the stroller. Both had delicate dark hair, and when one stirred and opened her eyes, startlingly blue and familiar, his stomach plummeted. The realization hit him like a wave. These were his daughters. Not a rumor, not a suspicion. There they were, the real, living proof of the life he had rejected. Sarah said nothing. She didn't cry or scream. She picked up the bottle, turned her back on him, and quietly walked into her hospital room. But Alex couldn't move. His body was rooted to the spot, his heart thrumming in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do next. The confrontation and the first step Alex stood outside the hospital room door for several minutes, unable to convince his legs to move or his mouth to form words. His brain was still trying to catch up to what his eyes had seen. Two tiny girls who looked so much like him, it felt like looking at baby pictures of himself. The woman he'd dismissed without a second thought was just beyond that door, raising his children alone while he'd gone on with his life, as if nothing had happened. A nurse walked by and gave him a slight look of concern, but he quickly straightened up and knocked twice, soft but firm. There was a pause, then the door cracked open. Sarah was there, calm but defensive, her eyes unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She raised her eyebrows slightly, waiting, then finally stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The room was small, dimly lit, with a cot pushed against the wall and two bassinets near the window. One of the girls was asleep. The other was gently squirming, making small noises as she flailed her tiny fists in the air. Alex stepped in slowly, as if a sudden movement might break the fragile moment. He walked up to the bassinets and looked down at the baby. Her eyes were closed, but her face was a mirror of his own mother's. There was no denying it. These were his daughters. "Are they?" he began, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah didn't look at him. She sat on the edge of the cot and crossed her arms tightly. "Yes," she said simply. "They're yours." The words hit him like a punch. He swayed slightly, then pulled the plastic chair near her bed and sat down heavily. The room was silent, save for the occasional beep of a nearby monitor and the soft sighs of the sleeping babies. Alex ran a hand through his hair, looking at the floor, then at her. She looked so different from the last time he'd seen her. Tired, pale, worn down, but somehow stronger, more centered, as if everything he'd overlooked before had finally surfaced. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his tone more confused than accusatory. Sarah gave a dry laugh, not cruel, but bitter. "I did. You just didn't care to listen." He opened his mouth to protest, but stopped, because she was right. He had cut her off, dismissed her, shut the door on any possibility that the pregnancy was real or that it mattered. Now he was sitting in the rubble of that moment, trying to pick up pieces that might be too broken to fix. He looked at her again, really looked at her this time, not as a problem to be solved or a mistake to be erased, but as a person who had endured something he couldn't yet grasp. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "and I didn't know what kind of man I was until now." Sarah turned to him then, not softening, but confronting him directly. "They have been in this hospital for 3 months, she said. "They were premature. I had surgery. I almost lost one of them. I haven't left this room for more than an hour in weeks. So forgive me if I'm not exactly thrilled to see you standing here like you won a medal for being late." Her voice wasn't loud, but the anger beneath it trembled like something tightly contained. Alex nodded, not defensively, but with real weight. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He looked at his daughters, then back at her. "Can I stay?" he asked, "just for a while." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked at her babies, both asleep again, and something shifted in her face. Less fury, more fatigue. She nodded once, then leaned back onto the cot and closed her eyes. Alex remained where he was, unmoving, just sitting there in a stunned silence. He still didn't know what this meant, didn't know what came next. But he understood one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't about pride, ego, or control anymore. This was about showing up, and for once in his life, he was willing to start there. The daily commitment. Alex returned the next day, earlier than he even expected himself to. He'd barely slept the night before. His mind had been a restless torrent of images and thoughts that wouldn't let him find peace. The sight of those two girls, so small and delicate, yet so undeniably his, had embedded itself into him in a way nothing else ever had. He found himself again in front of the same hospital room door at 7 a.m., carrying a paper bag with coffee and a small container of oatmeal, unsure if Sarah would accept them, but needing to try. He hesitated before knocking, worried she wouldn't want to see him again after the day before. But when the door opened, she didn't look surprised. She simply glanced at the bag and said, "You're late." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't a rejection either. He walked in, and she took the coffee without comment. The babies were awake, fussy but quiet, and Alex gravitated toward their bassinets instinctively. He peered down at Eliza, who was sucking on her fist, her tiny eyebrows furrowed as if she were concentrating very hard. Sarah watched him intently, but didn't interfere. She noticed his hesitation when he reached for the bottle, and without speaking, she handed it to him, allowing him to feed Eliza under her silent supervision. His hands were clumsy, but he was careful. Eliza accepted the bottle, and Alex watched her with awe as her little lips latched on. Something about the weight of that moment grounded him in a way no boardroom negotiation ever had. From that day on, Alex came every morning and stayed until the evening. He brought food, asked questions, read baby books in the waiting room during the girls' naps, and slowly learned how to change diapers and swaddle them correctly. Sarah didn't make it easy for him. She didn't pretend that his sudden involvement erased months of absence, but she didn't shut him out either. She gave him tasks to do, allowed him to take turns holding the girls, and even permitted him to be present during some of the pediatrician checkups. She remained cool, practical, and completely focused on the babies, never hinting if she saw a future for the two of them beyond this temporary hospital rhythm. Still, something began to shift. In the quiet hours of the day, when the girls were sleeping and the nurses had made their rounds, Alex and Sarah sometimes talked, not about them, not about the past, but about things that felt neutral and safe. He asked her about the freelance work she'd been doing, and she told him about the small projects she'd taken on, how she'd used her skills to barely get by. He talked to her about his firm's expansion, but in a softer, more human way, like someone describing a life he was no longer sure mattered. She listened, sometimes nodded, but often stayed silent. Yet her silence no longer felt cold. It felt cautious, like someone trying to rebuild a wall that had been torn down. One afternoon, while he was holding Clara against his chest, the baby fell asleep, and Alex felt his eyes water. He didn't openly cry, but his eyes grew glassy, and he blinked several times to keep the tears from falling. Sarah saw him and said nothing, simply handed him a burp cloth without comment, and he accepted it with a look of thanks. That moment, quiet and brief, felt like the first thread of trust tightening between them. Neither of them spoke of it afterward, but something unspoken hovered in the air from that day forward. Alex stopped checking his phone during visits, stopped answering work emails from the hospital room. His assistants were baffled by his absence, but he offered no explanations. For the first time in years, the business wasn't first. The girls were. And though Sarah didn't verbalize it, she noticed. She watched as he adapted, learned, and put in the effort. And while she wouldn't speak the words aloud, a small part of her started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was serious this time. By the end of the 5th week, the nurses no longer batted an eye when Alex walked in, and took one of the girls as naturally as if he had always been there. And while Sarah still held her walls high, her gaze lingered on him longer, her tone softened slightly, and when he brought a small stuffed giraffe for Clara and a Epsifier with a blue ribbon for Eliza, she didn't scoff. She barely smiled, but it was real. Alex saw it, treasured it silently in his heart, and didn't press for more. For now, showing up was enough. The home decision, the beginning of the 3rd month, Alex had seamlessly integrated into the hospital's daily rhythm, no longer a clumsy visitor, but a constant presence. The nurses spoke to him by name, giving him updates on Clara and Eliza without needing to ask who he was. Sarah also noted the subtle shift, how natural he moved now, the confidence with which he handled bottles, how he knew the exact lullaby that helped Clara fall asleep when she was fussy. He wasn't just trying anymore. He was here, every day, without fail, without excuses. The girls had gained weight steadily and were finally nearing the threshold for discharge. Sarah, while relieved, was also quietly terrified. For 3 months they had existed in this sterile, small, but safe cocoon. She had grown used to the monitors, the nurses, the shared responsibility. The hospital had become the strange bubble where her life had stabilized, where her grief had been put on pause by necessity. But soon she would leave. And then what? Back to a tiny apartment with barely space for 1 crib, let alone 2? Back to the routine of working all night while raising 2 babies alone? And now, with Alex's presence becoming a constant, something her daughters already expected. What if he disappeared again? Alex seemed to sense her anxiety, though she never voiced it aloud. One night, while Sarah was quietly folding the girls' hospital clothes, he asked softly, "Where will you go when they're discharged?" She hesitated, then answered cautiously, "Back to my apartment. It's small, but I've made do." He stared at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with something more complex: admiration, guilt, hesitation. "You shouldn't have had to make do alone," he said. Sarah didn't respond. The silence between them was thick with everything left unsaid. The next morning, he arrived with more than coffee. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a printed lease agreement for a small house a few blocks from her current apartment. 2 bedrooms, a yard, and a nursery already furnished. Sarah looked at him in disbelief. "I don't want you to think this is some grand gesture," he said. "I don't owe you anything. It's just a place. Safer, easier for them." She didn't respond right away. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect her independence, her pride. But then she looked at Eliza, who had just started trying to roll over, and Clara, who had finally gained enough strength to cry loudly when she wanted to be held. Sarah's pride wasn't more important than their well-being. Still, she kept her voice firm. "You're not buying us," she said. Alex nodded. "I know. It's not about that." Later that night, as the baby slept, Sarah stood at the window, arms crossed, as she watched the streetlights flicker below. Alex was reading quietly on the couch, one hand resting near Clara's bassinet. He didn't talk much anymore, unless she initiated the conversation. She appreciated that. It gave her space. Still, tonight felt heavier than usual. "Why did you really come back that day?" she asked suddenly. He didn't look up at first. Then he closed the book and said, "Because I got lost on the wrong floor. And then I saw you, and I realized everything I'd spent my life chasing meant nothing compared to what I threw away." His honesty surprised her. Not for what he said, but how he said it. Softly, without drama, without expectation. It wasn't a performance, it was just truth. She didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. She stayed by the window a while longer, and when she finally sat down, she did so beside him. The gap between them was still wide, but not as wide as it had been. The following week, the doctors finally gave the official news. Clara and Eliza were ready to go home. Alex was in the room when the announcement came, and Sarah saw him blink rapidly as if holding back tears. Discharge papers were signed, car seats were brought in, and tiny outfits were chosen. Alex carried the bags. Sarah carried Eliza. A nurse wheeled Clara into the hall. For the first time in months, they walked out of the hospital into the open air, the evening light casting soft shadows on the pavement. Alex didn't ask to ride with them, didn't offer. He simply followed in his own car, parked outside her building, and waited until she unlocked the front door. He helped carry the bags inside, and then stood in the doorway, unsure. Sarah looked at him, then stepped aside to let him in. It was small, cramped, barely space for the bassinets, but it was warm, and it was hers. And now, for the first time, she felt like maybe it didn't have to be hers alone. The new reality. The first few days at home were harder than Sarah had imagined, even after months in the hospital. Despite the joy of finally being out of the sterile walls and artificial light, she now had to face the full weight of life on her own turf. 2 newborns, who needed her attention every hour, feedings that blurred into one another, and sleepless nights that became the new routine. The apartment felt even smaller now, the cribs taking up the whole bedroom, and the tiny kitchen barely accommodating a bottle sterilizer and pump. Sarah found herself struggling to handle even the simplest things, like showering or making a full meal. The silence of the home, once a source of peace, became overwhelming in those long, crying-filled nights. Alex didn't ask to stay, never imposed himself. But the day after they were discharged, he showed up at her door just after dawn with grocery bags, and she didn't stop him from coming in. He moved silently through the kitchen, stocking the fridge with essentials, brewing coffee, and making oatmeal while the girls still slept. When Sarah woke up to the smell, for the first time in weeks, her body felt something close to safety. She walked into the kitchen bleary-eyed and unsure of what to say. But he didn't press, simply handed her a mug of coffee and said, "Sit, eat. I'll change them when they wake up." That became their rhythm. Alex arrived every morning and left late at night. Sometimes he cooked, sometimes he just cleaned, but he was always present. He held the girls when Sarah needed to nap, walked them around the apartment when they were fussy, and sat up with them in the middle of the night when colic stole their sleep. Sarah hesitated at first, always waiting for the moment he would stop showing up. But it never came. He returned again and again, each time more comfortable, more familiar, more quietly rooted in their lives. One evening, 2 weeks after coming home, Sarah found him sitting on the living room floor with both girls in his lap. They were dressed in matching onesies, and he was reading from a picture book about animals, mimicking the sounds with a gentleness she never would have expected from the man who once dismissed her so firmly. She stood in the hallway, watching the 3 of them under the soft glow of the lamp, something in her chest aching in a way she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just seeing her daughter smile or the warmth in Alex's voice. It was that, for the first time since she said she was pregnant, she didn't feel like she was surviving alone. He noticed her watching, but didn't say anything, simply continued reading, his voice quiet and steady. Later that night, when the girls were asleep, Sarah offered him a beer from the fridge, a tacit gesture that something was shifting between them. They sat on the couch, shoulders barely touching, the soft hum of the baby monitor filling the silence. Alex drank slowly, his gaze on the floor. "I think about that day in the office more than you know," he finally said. "About what I said, what I didn't say. I was a coward. I was selfish. I thought walking away would make it disappear." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She stared straight ahead, unsure whether his remorse should comfort her or anger her. But she finally said, "I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed you to care." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't care. Not then. But I care now." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked at her then, really looked at her, like someone seeing the full weight of what he had missed. Sarah's hands tightened around her mug. She wasn't ready to let go of all the pain yet. Not yet. But she was also tired of carrying it alone. "This isn't about us," she said finally. "It's about them. I can't afford for them to trust someone who won't stay." Alex nodded again, slower this time. "Then I'll just keep staying until you believe me." He did, day after day. Sarah stopped counting after the 4th week. By then, he had started helping with the freelance work too, setting up her website, handling minor invoices, giving her space to sleep for a few hours between client calls and bottle feedings. He never brought up their past unless she did. Never hinted that he wanted more. He simply became a part of her life, a quiet, unwavering support. Even the neighbors started referring to him as the girl's dad, and Sarah didn't correct them, because in every real sense, he was. At the girl's 6-month mark, Alex surprised her. He had printed every photo she had taken over the past months. First baths, first smiles, sleepy snuggles, and arranged them into a handmade scrapbook, leaving the last page blank. When she asked why, he said gently, "Because we're still writing the rest of it." Sarah stared at the blank page for a long moment before closing the book and whispering, "Let's hope it's a story worth finishing." Alex reached across the couch and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. In that quiet moment, no forgiveness was uttered, no declarations of love or dramatic promises, only presence, only choice. And for now, that was more than enough. The first birthday, the night before Clara and Eliza's first birthday, Sarah found herself alone in the living room, surrounded by balloons she hadn't yet hung and cupcakes she hadn't yet frosted. The girls were asleep in their cribs after a chaotic bath time, and Alex had gone to pick up some last-minute decorations from the store. The apartment, though still small, now felt different, filled with warmth and history, marked by the constant hum of the life that had been carefully and painfully built over the last year. The walls showed signs of their history, framed photos, crayon smudges, and even a small dent near the hallway from when Alex accidentally bumped the stroller into the corner. Sarah stood quietly, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to absorb the reality of what they had become. This year had tested her in every imaginable way. There were nights she cried alone in the bathroom just to release the pressure of being everything all at once: mother, provider, protector. But Alex had been there, every single day, quietly reinforcing the foundation beneath her with actions, not promises. He never pressured, never rushed her healing, never demanded what their relationship should be. Instead, he devoted himself to the role of father with a devotion that sometimes amazed her. He remembered every doctor's appointment, handled middle-of-the-night fevers with precise calm. He'd memorized their favorite songs, their feeding schedules, even which pacifier each one preferred. At some point, without either of them announcing it, they had become a family. When he returned that night, arms full of streamers and paper crowns, he gave her a tired but genuine smile. "I think I bought out the entire party aisle," he joked. But Sarah could hear the underlying nerves in his voice. They both knew what this night symbolized. It wasn't just a birthday. It was the end of the first chapter, and possibly the beginning of something more. After the girls were settled back down, after stories and lullabies, and Eliza's stubborn refusal to fall asleep until Alex had rocked her for 10 full minutes, Sarah and Alex found themselves sitting at the small kitchen table, sharing a slice of early birthday cake. The air was different, more fragile. She looked at him and said, "You've done more than I ever expected you to do." He looked back at her, carefully. "I didn't come here to prove something. I came because I couldn't imagine not being here." She hesitated, then got up and walked over to the small living room shelf where the scrapbook still sat. She opened it to the last page, the blank one, and placed a photo there, that she had printed just hours before. It was all four of them, on the couch. The girls in matching pajamas, Alex mid-laugh, and Sarah looking at him with an expression she hadn't realized was captured. Hopeful. Open. Complete. She slid the photo into the sleeve and whispered, "That's our new first page." Alex crossed the room slowly, unsure what to say. But before he could speak, Sarah turned to face him. "You hurt me. More than I thought I could recover from," she said, her voice steady. "But you stayed. You stayed through every hard night, every diaper, every fever, every fight. You showed me who you could be. And that version of you, I love him." It wasn't a dramatic kiss or a sweeping embrace. He simply stepped forward and took her hand. His fingers trembled. "Then let me be him, forever. For you, for them." And this time, she didn't hesitate. She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to lean into him, not because she needed to be saved, but because she finally believed she didn't have to carry it all alone. The next morning, their apartment was filled with laughter, baby squeals, and the slightly off-key singing of two tired but joyful parents. Balloons bounced on the ceiling, streamers tangled on the chairs, cupcakes smeared on tiny hands. It wasn't a perfect party, but it was real, and that made it beautiful. Friends stopped by with gifts. Neighbors came in for hugs with the girls, and Sarah paused by the window at one point, holding Eliza while Clara crawled after a balloon, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Alex came up behind her, his hand resting gently on her back. "I know I can't go back and rewrite everything," he said softly, "but I want to write the rest with you, whatever it looks like." Sarah turned and kissed his cheek. "Then let's keep turning the page, together." And in that crowded, joyful, chaotic room, they did just that. No grand vows, no perfect ending. Just love in its truest, most patient form. The open ending, the blank page. The morning of Clara and Eliza's first birthday arrived with the spring sun flooding the small apartment. Sarah stood in the living room, observing the beautiful chaos. Balloons, streamers, and smeared frosting on two small cupcakes. Everything was a mess, but it was their mess. Alex was in the kitchen, attempting to brew strong coffee to fight the night's sleep deprivation. He was no longer the cold man of Vance Capital. He was a tired father, with formula on his shirt and infinite patience. He walked into the living room and saw Sarah by the window, holding the scrapbook he had given her. He knew she was looking at the last page, the blank one. "I bought more photo paper," Alex said, his voice soft. "We can print today's pictures. Finish the chapter." Sarah turned, her face a mix of love, faith, and something indelible. "I'm going to leave that page blank, Alex," she said, not as a punishment, but as a truth. "You have shown me who you can be this year. You've rebuilt the trust I lost." He nodded, understanding the gravity of those words. "You've placed your faith in me, Sarah. I won't fail you again." "I don't believe your words," she replied, with a bittersweet smile. "I believe what you did yesterday and what you do today, and I won't allow you to write that page alone ever again." They both looked over at where their daughters were crawling on the floor. Clara was tugging at a tablecloth, while Eliza was attempting to lick a balloon. They were the center, the reason, and the only certainty in their lives. Alex walked over, not to hug Sarah, but to place his hand on her shoulder, an act of silent commitment. "We'll keep going forward, together," he said. Sarah nodded. She believed him today, but she knew that somewhere, Alex's old life, with its early flights, its business bids, and the temptation of absolute power, still waited. She had forgiven him. She loved him, but she couldn't erase the feeling of being abandoned. She squeezed the album in her hand and looked at Alex, and then at the girls. The love had returned, but the guarantee had not. "Let's open another present, Alex," she said, her voice filled with a new determination, "and see what tomorrow brings." She smiled, not to end the story, but to accept that the next page was still being written. Will Alex Vance be able to balance his empire with his new role as a father and partner, or will his career return to define who he is? The future of this family remains on the blank page. The open ending. The unwritten page. The morning of Clara and Eliza's first birthday arrived with the spring sun flooding the small, lived-in apartment. Sarah stood in the living room, observing the beautiful chaos. Balloons, streamers, and smeared frosting on 2 small cupcakes. Everything was a glorious mess, but it was their mess. Alex Vance walked in from the kitchen, a tired father with coffee steam rising from his mug, a stark contrast to the cold magnate of Vance Capital. He saw Sarah by the window, holding the scrapbook he had given her, looking at the final blank page. "I bought more photo paper," Alex said, his voice softer than any boardroom ever heard it. "We can print today's pictures. Finish the chapter." Sarah turned, her expression a mix of love, faith, and an indelible caution. "I'm going to leave that page blank, Alex," she said, not as a punishment, but as a statement of truth. "You have shown me who you can be this year. You've rebuilt the trust I lost with your actions, day after day." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You've placed your faith in me, Sarah. I won't fail you again." "I don't believe your words," she replied, with a bittersweet smile. "I believe in what you did yesterday, and what you do today, and I won't allow you to write that page alone ever again." They both looked over at where their daughters were crawling on the floor. Clara was tugging at a tablecloth, while Eliza was attempting to lick a balloon. They were the center, the reason, and the only certainty in their lives. Alex walked over, placing his hand gently on her shoulder, a silent act of commitment. "We'll keep going forward, together," he affirmed. Sarah nodded. She believed him. Today. But she knew that somewhere, Alex's old life, the early flights, the aggressive business bids, the intoxicating lure of absolute power, still waited. She had forgiven him. She loved him. But she couldn't erase the feeling of once being abandoned. She squeezed the album in her hand, looking at Alex and then at the girls. The love had returned, but the guarantee had not. "Let's open another gift, Alex," she said, her voice filled with a new determination, "and see what tomorrow brings." She smiled, not to end the story, but to accept that the next page is still being written. The question that remains. Alex Vance is now committed to a life built on vulnerability and presence. But the Vance Capital empire still demands a ruthless leader. Can he truly balance his billion-dollar identity with the tender role of husband and father? Or will the persistent pull of his old world eventually force him to choose? The ultimate outcome for this fragile, beautiful family remains on that blank page.